how do we finish up creation? Today we look at days 3 and 6 and we see how God finishes forming things, but then he also finishes filling it. Check it out as we see how God created the heavens and the earth.
We are so glad that you have joined us today and you're still surviving the start of summer. But first, I want to invite you, if you are new here and you're a guest, I would love a chance to say hi to you and get to meet you. I'll be at the tent right after service. But today, we are also excited because right after the sermon, I'm going to tell you, do not leave, okay? And don't leave in the middle of the sermon, or don't fall asleep. But right after the sermon, we're not just going to have a song, but we're going to do something special, kind of make an announcement of something that's changing on our staff, just kind of a title that's being given, and we want you to be a part of that moment. But today, we are diving into the book of Genesis and continuing our series, this counterculture, talking about creation. And if you've been with us this entire time, all we've been talking about, we're still in chapter 1, right? I promise not every single chapter we're going to spend like 5-6 weeks in. Otherwise, we're going to be in here for a couple years. But we're continuing this. In the next few weeks, we're going to kind of get into some really, really culturally relevant things. Because as we dive into this, some topics are going to come up. As we talk about mankind, we're going to kind of just barely touch that today. But next week, we're going to dive into that more. We're going to talk about identity. We're going to talk about marriage. And you're probably going to have people in your lives that are going to be mad about what you hear. Maybe you're going to be mad about what is heard over these next few weeks. And that's okay as we talk and we wrestle through some of these texts. But that is what's coming. But today we're going to see God finish up kind of the creative steps and then the creation process. And if you've been with us, here's how we started this. We started and kind of did an overview of Genesis. And we said that the goal of Genesis is to introduce us to the God of creation who is also Lord of our life. This giant God who created everything, things that we can't even think of, that is so big, that is so grand, but yet he still wants to know you and have a relationship with you. Oh, that should blow your mind right there, right? We could just stop there. That's what I'm going to talk about for 40 minutes. No, I'm just kidding. But that's what we talk about. Everything in Genesis kind of points to this topic. And then we got into the creation account. And we started to dissect, so how did God do this? And I warned you before, we're going to study this in kind of a weird way. And some people, maybe your brain doesn't work this way, but it's kind of how the text lines up, is in the first 3 days, God forms stuff. And in the second 3 days, days 4 through 6, he fills it. So in day 1, God formed light. And in day 4, he filled the sun and the moon and the stars with that light. And in day 2, and we talked about how God, that darkness is not God's intent, but light is God's intent. And he wants us to live in light. And we talked about that the second week. Then we moved on to water. And water is a crazy concept. You need water to survive. You're really feeling that, right, when it's 115 out. But we talked about how in day 2, God separated water. He made the ocean. He made the clouds. He made the skies. And then in day 4, he filled it with birds and fish to be able to inhabit those areas. And last week, we talked about how not only do we physically need water, but we need living spiritual water of life to ultimately know God and experience true eternity with him. Well, today we're going to turn our attention to days 3 and 6. And we're going to see how God kind of wraps up this creation process. And as we do that, I want to give you a key thought today that this kind of summarizes a little bit of what we've hit so far, but also what we're going to study today. And it is this, that the Genesis account shows the order and the beauty of God's character. I love this balance in the early chapters of Genesis where we said this in week 1, that it's not meant to be a scientific book, but when Genesis speaks on scientific matters, it speaks with authority and with truth. And we saw this as we've studied, that as you kind of dive into this, you see how God starts to set in motion the order of the universe. It speaks to ecosystems and how he kind of made all this happen, and he sets in this universe that has an order to it. But then we also said that Genesis is also not meant to be a book of poetry, but that when it does speak of in poetic tones, it does so in a beautiful fashion. We also see this on full display in the imagery in Genesis chapter 1 that it presents. That all these literary parallels we talked about, days 1 and 3, days 2 and 4, days 3 and 6, they have this connection in a way that all the author beautifully displays this concept of creation and paints this picture that our brains can't even fully comprehend. And we even see it at the start of the book when it says, it just assumes that we know that there is a God. It says, in the beginning, God. It doesn't say where God came from. It doesn't say how God came into being, how God was created. It just says he was there. Actually, my son, just this last week, we were going to bed and he prayed. He said, I want to pray. I said, okay. And he said, thank you for everyone in the entire world, right? I'm like, wrap this up so you can go to sleep. And he said, and thank you for Jesus. I'm like, oh, that's nice. And then he said, amen. And then he ended, he said, who created God? I'm like, spoiler alert, nobody. And then and his little brain was like, huh? And I was like, he's just been there forever. Nobody created God. He's been there forever and will always be there forever. He's like, forever? And I'm like, go sleep on that and your brain might explode, right? He's only 4 years old. So that concept was like about to blow his brain up a little bit. But as we see this and we come to days 3 and 6, here's where all this leads to as we wrap up this creation account. I want us to ask a question stemming from our key thought is, how does God show us this? How does he show us his order and his beauty in creation? And here's what's so amazing. As we dive into this, I think we're going to get to answer this question and see this on full display. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip to Genesis chapter 1. And we're going to be starting in verse 9. And depending on how big of words your Bible is, this might be the last week we're on page 1 of the Bible. I've been making it easy for you, right? Flip to page 1 and you're there. But in Genesis chapter 1, verse 9, we're going to kind of go in and we're going to start in day 3, like we said here. And the first thing we're going to see of how God shows us a part of this is going into day 3, we have light, we have an ocean, we have clouds and a sky. And then we see that God shows his order in finalizing the form of creation. Check out verse 9 as we read this. It says this, that then God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the water he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And it was so. The earth produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants according to their kinds, and tree bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Verse 13, evening came, and then the morning, the third day. If you've been with us, I've said this, and I said it again, that quite a few times, that the first 3 days are all about forming. And another translation here would be to God creates the resource of our world. He creates the resource that would be created in order to sustain life for ages to come. And day 3 in here is kind of the final step in setting down that foundation of the world we know. One of my son's favorite toys is, well, I say favorite, like one day, your kids, their favorite toy is like something you buy them. The next day it's a box, and then it changes every day, right? 3 kids under 5, it's so fun. I'm like, here's this expensive Spider-Man set. It's cool for 2 days, and then they don't care. But anyway, he has these one toys called magnetiles. They're literally magnetic tiles, and they're actually like a cool STEM toy. Like they're all these different shapes, so you're kind of teaching your kid geometry as you tell them to go build something cool. And you like get the fool them like, haha, you're learning, right? But he loves putting these magnetiles together, and he kind of ups the ante as he like builds a tower or a house or a car, and then he starts throwing other toys in it. But what I tried to tell him is like, you can't throw that toy, and he actually likes to make jails for his toys, which maybe I should be concerned about. But I'm like, you can't put your little action figure in a jail yet if you don't finish the foundation of it. Like, I'm like, and I get mad at him because I'm trying to build something cool, and then he throws a toy and wrecks it all. I'm like, right, we gotta build it strong first before you can play with it rough. And God here, before he throws man into the earth, he doesn't just throw him on day 1 to where mankind just sinks into a dark abyss. There's no light, there's no land, there's just water. Like God has this kind of foundation that he sets, and he handles creation this way. And an interesting note here is in that the first day, this is the first day in day 3 where God examines what he created. And he actually says that it's good twice in day 3. So how did day 3 practically unfold? Well, first we see that the first happened is there was the appearing of dry land. Check out verse 9. It says, then God said, let the water under the sky be gathered into one place. And the gathering of the water, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And it says, God called the dry land earth. You see, this is the first thing that we see is God in day 3, he starts to bring up this land, this place that mankind would eventually inhabit, right? We don't have gills, we can't swim in the sea, but instead God creates this land. But there's something special about it. One commentator says it this way, that the earth that is talked about here, it produces and sustains life. It provides a wealth of life and the necessary space for land creatures and people. The word land here connotates that which is benevolently ordered by God's sovereignty in the interest of human life and security. Meaning this is something God created, this is something God is sovereign over, but he almost gives it as a gift. Psalm 24, 1-2 says, the earth and everything in it, the world and its inhabitants belong to the Lord. For he laid its foundation on the seas and established it on the rivers. But God didn't just give this and create this land to be sovereign over. Instead, he gifted it to mankind. Proverbs 2:21 says, for the upright will inhabit the land, and those of integrity will remain in it. But the wicked will be cut off from the land, and the treacherous ripped out of it. You see, the land or the earth, as we said, is kind of a big deal. God didn't create us to be sea creatures. He created sea creatures that could live in the water. And I thought about this the other day, like, it's not like we can even change and all of a sudden, like, right now we don't have gills and then one day we'll have gills. Like, I saw a trailer for the new Avatar movie recently. And in Avatar 1, they're on land. And in Avatar 2, all of a sudden they're in water. Like, I don't understand how that works. Like, now the blue creatures, I guess, have gills so they can live underwater. Mankind doesn't work that way, right? So instead, God created land for us to be on, to inhabit. But we also see God didn't stop here, because not only did he create land, but then the next step is that the gathering of the water became the seas. Check out the second half of verse 10. And he said, the gathering of water he called seas, and God saw that it was good. We talked a lot last week about water in day 2 and days 5, where it's a huge subject there. And we saw how God separated the ocean from the clouds, and then he created the sky and the atmosphere that kind of broke these up. But what's also cool here is when it says that God separated the land and the water here, this marks the third and final separation we see in the Genesis account. That God separated light from darkness. He separated water from water and the clouds and the ocean. And here he separates land from the ocean and creates these seas. But here's what's cool about this. As God says here, after this separation in this land, and he starts creating all these seas, so it's not just one big ocean, but you have fresh water, you have salt water, you have rivers, you have all these different oceans and seas around. But when God sees all this, he says that it was good. You see, as we mentioned here, there's 2 good statements. First, he says this, but why is this so significant? Because then God goes into kind of a second creation act in this day 3. And this we see is in the production of the earth that led to vegetation. Let's read 11 again. It says, then God said, let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and fruit trees on the earth, bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And it was so. The earth produced vegetation, both seed-bearing plants and tree-bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And it says, evening came, and then the morning, the third day. Another interesting and kind of important fact that we get from here is that God, this is the first time we see an indirect creation from God. Everything up until this point, God has been speaking creation into existence. Out of nothing it came. But here he creates the earth, he creates light, he creates all the foundation for it. And then it says, up from the earth came the plants. But you see, those plants, like I said, didn't come by themselves, but it was by the system that God set around it. We see that all that God put into motion kind of creates this ecosystem, creates this environment for something to grow into. I was thinking about this last week, and it's been about 2 years of a journey now that we kind of dreamed this dream of how can we take something that's a dirt lot that's ugly and turn it into something. If you've been here that long, there was nothing out there, right? So we're like, let's make a garden. 2 years ago, I'm a city boy. I grew up in Phoenix. I know nothing about keeping a plant alive, okay? I'm pretty sure they need water. I think I'm right on that. But I'm like, a farmer? Like, look at me. Do I look like a farmer, right? hipster farming is what I kind of try to go for. But I was like, we have known nothing of what we're doing there. So it began this process of learning about this, and really over the last year plus, we've just done a ton of work of how can we create this and cultivate it, and God sent the right people for us to do that. But what I've learned a lot about gardening is some of the basics is you need water and you need sun. But how much or how little of that is going to determine whether or not your plants actually live, right? Usually in Arizona, you don't get too much water. Usually it's you get too much sun and not enough water. But it's how you blend those, how you create that system. And here, God, he created the clouds that are already raining down on the soil. He already had light. The form of light was already created. So this ecosystem of the earth is already starting, and it sees these plants starting to rise up. And what's important to note here, though, is that in order for the order of nature to produce, it wasn't based on them, something that old religions thought, like this was Mother Earth and you had to make sacrifices and worship. Rather, it was merely a vessel of God's creation, that all of a sudden this became, and it started multiplying, and this started becoming fruitful on the earth. And the language here is used for the very first time that they will be used the next 3 days, that God created them according to their kinds, meaning that the different things were created for distinct and specific purposes. Now I want to just stop right here. And here's the moment where, say, God looks over at day 3, and God has kind of created this whole foundation. And say if you read up to this point, you might start trying to make some predictions. This last week, I finished Stranger Things season 4, volume 1. Anyone with me? Okay. And Josh and I text a lot during that time, our worship leader. And we text, and he likes to give predictions of what's going to happen next. But all the predictions we are given is based on the information we have. And then when we watch an episode, Josh texts me, he's like, I knew that was going to happen. I'm like, you're such a liar. Like, you didn't actually know that. I was like, there's a really big twist coming up because I finished before him. He's like, oh yeah, I saw that coming. It's like, you did not. Like, whatever. Nobody saw that coming. But here's what you do when you watch a TV show is you watch, or you're consuming all this information, and then you're predicting what you think is going to happen. Now, fast forward when Genesis was written, or I'm sorry, rewind when Genesis was written. This was written about 3,500 years ago by a man named Moses. And some people will claim that the creation account, that the Bible, that this was just written, it's a myth, it's not real, that he just thought it up in his head and he just threw it on paper. But imagine all of a sudden you're just standing 3,500 years ago before science, before all these discoveries we've made over the last thousands of years, and you're looking at the world and you're like, yeah, I think I know how this was all created. Because the pagans around them, they were sacrificing children and having sex rituals in order to please the gods of creation, like the sun, the moon, and the earth, because they thought that's how it came about. But then Moses starts writing, he's like, no, God told me exactly how it happened. It happened in this orderly fashion. It happened in a way that still lines up with science today, that when there's scientific accuracy of how these ecosystems, what was created in what order, that it still makes sense. And what I love here is that we get to look and we see this account that God gave this orderly system and fashion to us, that this isn't just a myth, but this is actually his truth. But then we continue. And I want to make a turn here because we not only see the order of God's creation, but we also get to see his beauty. And God shows his beauty in finishing the fill of creation. Skip down to verse 24. And in verse 24, it says, then God said, let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that crawl, and the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. So God made the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Again, he's going to say this twice in day 6, just like he did in day 3. Verse 26, then God said, let us make man in our own image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created the male and female. God blessed them and said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and every creature that crawls on the earth. God also said, look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seed. This will be food for you. For all the wildlife of the earth, for every bird of the sky, and for every creature that crawls on the earth, everything having the breath of life in it, I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. Verse 31, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good indeed. Evening came, and then morning, the sixth day. Now, a lot happens here in day 6. And like I said, we're actually going to stop kind of like going too far into detail here. And we're going to pick back up in this next week because I don't have another 40 minutes today that I can spend into this. But here's kind of a few notes to kind of point out in here as we kind of see this starting to be fleshed out, is this marks the end of God's creation. The first 3 days, he created this resource. The second 3 days, or day 4 through 6, he creates the one who will utilize this. And he does this in kind of 2 steps. The first section of day 6 is he creates all the land creatures, which would become wildlife, livestock, and crawlers. In verse 24, he says this: let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, livestock, creatures that crawl, and the wildlife of the earth. Now, in the Hebrew language, this would actually divide into kind of 3 different categories as they would do this. Livestock is what they would almost define as animals they would eat, non-carnivore animals, like stuff you would see on the farm. And that actually gets fleshed out in more detail later on, but in the earliest stages, they would kind of do it that way. The wildlife would be all those other carnivores, those ones that are roaming the wilds. My kids and I, when we're driving around the 303 every now and then, when I go to a surprise campus, which is like East LA, I call it, there's one, it's pretty far out there. We're coming around the 303, and every now and then we see cows and horses. And I don't know if a guy owns them, but I'm like, those are wildlife, right? You know, like they're just, no, they're free. And they're like, what's the difference between wild and like domestic? I'm like, well, the wild, nobody cares for them. They just do what they want, and they find grass where they want. Someone probably owns those, but who knows? But my kids kind of get that concept early on, but here they make this distinction between those they would eat, those they wouldn't, and then there's the crawlers. And the crawlers would be reptiles like snakes, lizards, everything you would want to shoot or, run away from really quick. But here's what's interesting. One is God creates these creatures, but he doesn't bless them. In the other 2 days before this, God creates sea creatures and he blesses them, says, be fruitful and multiply. That water was like those sea creatures, those fishes' domain. And that same day, he creates birds of the air. He says, be fruitful and multiply. He's like, own the air. The air is yours and Tom Cruise, right? Okay. It was a great movie. You should go see it. But the land animals, he doesn't give this blessing to. They almost, like the birds and the fish, they get to kind of like create, they get to have domain over their areas. They are almost in charge of it. But God still does give a special designation as the very highest point of all creation, which brings us to the second part of this day 6, which the pinnacle of creation became mankind. Verse 26, I'm just going to read that one verse again. It says, then God said, let us make a man in our own image, according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. Again, we don't have time to dissect this fully, but ultimately God put mankind on earth to be the highest point of his creation. I almost picture it this way. And whenever I read the Bible, I try to think of pictures. What does this look like modern day? Like, how does this unfold? How do we like kind of tell this story? And I'm almost thinking like creating a cake. Used to go to weddings and there used to be like really beautiful cakes. Now you go to a wedding and there's either no cake or it's like this big and then they just give you cupcakes in the back, right? Cheapos, right? If I'm going to go to a wedding, at least give me some cake. Or, you know what, put the cake out earlier because I don't want to stay through your whole stuff and then get cake. Like, just give it to me while you're taking pictures and I'll be happy. I love weddings so much. But anyway, like a cake, this beautiful cake where you start, first you do the cake ingredients, then you put frosting all over it, and then the cake kind of gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And then eventually, there's like a topper. Whether it's a plastic topper, it's a beautiful topper of frosting. And when you go and you see that cake, what's the first thing you look at? The topper. The thing that the cake was made for. The cake was made to display, Susie and Ben's wonderful wedding and union, right? And the whole point of that cake was to display whatever. If it's a child's birthday, it's to display Spider-Man, okay? And that's what all the focus goes to. And what we see here in day 6 is that God creates all this, that he creates this entire universe, but it was all for mankind. That they were the pinnacle of his creation. It was a love letter, a gift to us. And God created this grand, huge scale that's bigger than our mind can imagine. Let me just kind of illustrate this for you in one way. That scientists have estimated the universe has 200 billion trillion stars. Another way of saying is 200 sextillion. I didn't know that was a number, okay? Google told me this, so it must be right. That's a lot when I read that. But here's what's also crazy. Is the average human has 37.2 trillion cells in their body. And there's 7 billion humans on the earth right now. So if you take 37.2 trillion times 7 billion, I tried to do it in Google and they wouldn't give me a name for it. It was just, back to like algebra in high school and it said like to the 25th power or something like that. And I was like, what's that called? They wouldn't tell me. But the point is that God made this grand, huge scale, this canvas, this beautiful creation that we can't even begin to fathom. But he also saved some of his greatest artwork for the smallest, minutest detail in us. And you see, that's the beauty we see here in the creation account. That God makes this huge thing and shows this order of the universe, but also shows the beauty in what he gives to mankind. So here's our question today is like, what do we do with all this? Okay, that's great. And you've rambled on for like 35 minutes. It hasn't been that long yet. And you've talked about this. How do we respond to this? Well, here's what I want to give you, and here's what I think our response should be as we go out into our world, as we see God's great creation, as we see what he did not only at the beginning of time, but we see what's in front of us, and we see how wonderful and fearfully we are made, is that when we go into our world, we should be recognizing the order and beauty of our world and trusting the God who made it all. You see, if you truly believe that God made all of this, and I hope you do, and you truly believe that God made you, then you should be able to trust him with whatever life hands you. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 5 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not rely on your own understanding. In all your ways know him and he will make your paths straight. You see, that seems like such a simple concept. And you're like, yeah, I trust God. But do you? There's so many things in our life that we try to take control of, right? We are the pinnacle of creation. We are the smartest beings on earth. We're smarter than dolphins, I believe it, okay? We're the pinnacle of creation, but sometimes we get in our own head and we think we're the smartest of the smartest on all of earth. That I don't need to trust God in my family, in my finances, in my career. I don't need to trust God in my relationships. I don't need to trust God because I've got this. But you see, we serve and we worship a God who really does got this, who really did create all this, but he also created you. And when we look to this God and we see here that we know that if this God is big enough to create everything, he's big enough to solve any problem that you put in front of him. And this God is also, if he is loving enough to form and fill the universe for you and with you, then he's also loving enough to send his son, Jesus Christ, to live, to die, so that we are no longer beholden to our path, but we can live forever with him. And my challenge for you, my prayer for you, is that as we reflect on this grand, huge God, that we also think about how he loves us, how he created us, and we can trust him no matter what comes out in our life. Let's pray this morning.